Imagine this. You have lost everything. Your father, your mother, your home, your last coin. And the only thing standing between you and freezing to death in the English countryside is a room full of strangers you have never met. You walk in, you ask for work, you ask for nothing more than a chance, and they laugh at you. Now imagine, in that same room, in that same moment, one quiet man slowly sets down his drink, pushes back his chair, and stands up. Not with pity, not with charity, but with something no one in that room could have seen coming. He looks across that crowded, fire-lit room, and he says in a voice low and steady as the earth itself, "I do not need a worker, miss. I need a wife." The room goes silent. Your heart stops, and the rest of your life begins right there. This is the story of Clara Bennett and the winter of 1877 that changed everything. The snow did not fall gently that night. It came sideways, driven hard across the moors by a wind that had no mercy in it. A wind that tore through wool coats and froze the breath before it could rise. The hills of Hawthorne Village had disappeared entirely, swallowed into a white blindness that made the world feel very small and very unforgiving. Inside the Black Fox Inn, the fire crackled high, and the room smelled of burning oak and warm ale. A dozen or more villagers had pressed themselves inside to wait out the storm. Farmers, tradesmen, a baker's wife and her 2 young sons, a blacksmith whose hands were still dark with the day's work. They spoke in low voices, grateful for walls and warmth, grateful the storm was out there and they were in here. And then the door flew open, not gently, not with a knock. It burst inward on a gust of wind so cold it silenced every voice in the room at once. The flames in the hearth lurched sideways. 3 candles went dark, and every head turned toward the door. Standing in the opening, framed by a wall of black sky and driving white snow, was a young woman. She was not dressed for Yorkshire in January. Her coat was thin, something made for autumn at best, never for a night that could kill a man in an hour. Her boots were soaked entirely through. Her dark hair was plastered flat against her pale cheeks by the melting snow. Her lips had gone a frightening shade of blue. She stood gripping the doorframe with both hands, not for drama, not for effect, but because without it she would have fallen. Her eyes swept the room, slowly, steadily, undefeated. And then she spoke, in a voice that was quiet and clear and absolutely unashamed. "I am looking for honest work. I will do anything that is needed. I ask only for a warm place to sleep and 1 meal a day, and I will earn both 100 times over." No one moved. No one spoke. And then, softly at first, and then louder, the laughter began. Her name was Clara Bennett. She was 24 years old. She had been born in Leeds, the second daughter of a school-teacher father and a mother whose hands were never still. Clara had grown up understanding what it truly meant to work, not for ambition, but for survival. She could bake bread and keep accounts. She could tend a sick animal and mend a broken fence. She could carry water and work from first light until the stars came out without complaint. She was not fragile. She had never been permitted to be. Her father had died in the spring, quietly in his chair, with a book still open in his lap. Her mother had followed him in August, as though she had decided there was no longer any reason to remain in a world he was no longer in. Clara had buried them both, alone, with no family left to stand beside her, and no time to fall apart. By November, the savings were gone. By December, so was the house. Someone in Leeds had told her about the farming villages in the Yorkshire Hills, that there was work there, that a decent inn in a village called Hawthorne might offer a fair chance. She had walked 22 miles through the snow to find out. And now she stood here, listening to strangers laugh, and she did not cry, she did not plead, she simply stood and waited because she had nowhere else to go. What those laughing men could not see, what no one in that warm, firelit room could have known, was what had happened 3 nights before Clara arrived in Hawthorne. She had stopped to rest in a small stone barn on the edge of an abandoned farm, about 8 miles outside the village. The snow had been too heavy to continue, and the dark too complete. She had crawled into the corner behind a stack of old hay bales and pulled her thin coat tight around her and waited for the morning. And in that darkness, in that cold, empty barn with no one to see and no reason left to hold herself together, Clara had finally let herself cry. Not for herself. She had made her peace with her own struggle. She cried for her mother's hands, those small, tireless hands that had sewn through candlelight long after Clara was in bed so that there would be bread in the morning. Those hands that had held Clara's face the day her father was buried and whispered, "We are still here. We are still standing." And then those hands had gone still too. Clara sat in the dark of that abandoned barn and wept until there was nothing left. And then she wiped her face on her coat sleeve, straightened her back, and made herself a quiet promise. "I will not stop. Not yet. There is still something ahead of me. I do not know what it is, but I will walk toward it." She had risen before dawn and walked the last 8 miles in the dark. That was the woman who had arrived at the Black Fox Inn. That was the woman now waiting in the doorway. At the far end of the room, seated alone at a corner table, a man had been watching since the moment the door opened. He had not laughed, not even close. Thomas Whitmore was 31 years old, weathered and square-jawed, with thick dark hair and gray eyes that were calm and watchful and missed very little. His hands, resting around a barely touched cup, were the hands of a man who worked real land, rough, scarred, capable. He was not cruel, he was not cold, he was simply solitary. He had inherited 40 acres from his father at 22, the same year his mother had passed from a fever the village doctor had not caught in time. He had worked the land alone since then, cattle, winter wheat, a small flock of hardy sheep, not because he preferred loneliness, but because life had quietly arranged itself that way. He had thought about hiring help, but help cost money the farm didn't earn in winter months. He had thought more quietly about marriage, but that thought always felt too much like hope, and Thomas had learned to be careful with hope. Now he watched this young woman stand in the doorway and refuse, absolutely refuse to break, and something in his chest, still and silent for years, shifted. The innkeeper crossed the room and told Clara plainly, no work, no free rooms. If she had coins, welcome. If not, he was sorry. Clara thanked him, turned back toward the door, back toward the storm, the dark, the cold. Thomas was on his feet before he had fully decided to stand. "Miss." Half the room turned. Clara stopped. "You said you want honest work."
She turned. Blue eyes met gray ones across the room. "I do. Any honest work." Thomas chose his words carefully, like a man choosing his footing on uncertain ice. "I have a farm, 40 acres, cattle, wheat, sheep. I have been managing alone, and I am behind. I need help." "I can work," she said simply. "I know, but a hired hand through a full winter I cannot afford. What I can offer is a different arrangement, a partnership, shared labor, shared shelter, shared meals." A pause. I am not speaking of romance. I am speaking of two people with the same problem, and perhaps one answer between them. The room had gone completely silent. You are asking me to marry you, a man whose name I do not yet know. Thomas Whitmore, and yes, I am. The wind screamed outside. A log collapsed in the fire. Clara looked at him for a long, steady moment. I accept, she said. Reverend Mills performed the ceremony the following morning in the cold stone chapel. No flowers, no music, no joyful tears, just two people, two witnesses, and a set of vows spoken clearly and honestly in the gray winter light. When it was done, they shook hands, like partners beginning a long journey, and walked together through 6 inches of snow to the farm. The farmhouse was plain and cold. Clara did not flinch. She laid a fire, found flour and lard, and set bread to bake while Thomas tended the animals. When he returned 2 hours later, the kitchen was warm, the bread was in the oven, and the table was set for 2. He stood in the doorway and could not move for a moment. 9 years of eating alone, and now a table set for 2. Sit down, Mr. Whitmore, Clara said without turning. You look like you haven't been properly warm since October. Thomas, he said quietly. She turned, and there was almost a smile. Thomas, she said. The weeks that followed were the hardest either of them had ever lived, and also, quietly, unexpectedly, the most alive. The storm did not ease for 3 full weeks. The roads became impassable. They were sealed in together, 2 near strangers and 40 acres and 200 animals in the coldest Yorkshire winter in a generation. They rose before first light. They worked until dark. They fell asleep each night with the deep exhaustion of people who have used every last piece of themselves. And in the small, quiet margins of rest, by the fire in the evenings, too tired to pretend, they began to talk. She told him about her father's voice reading aloud in the evenings, about her mother's hands, about the morning she stood alone in the churchyard and felt for the first time what it truly meant to have no one left. He told her about his father's laugh and his mother's garden, and the afternoon he had ridden home from Leeds Market at 22, whistling, not knowing yet, and then knowing all at once as he came through the door. They talked about loneliness the way neither had ever spoken it aloud, not with self-pity, but with the careful honesty of two people who have been carrying something heavy, and find, to their surprise, that the other person knows exactly what it weighs. One morning before dawn, Thomas rose to check a struggling heifer. Clara heard him and followed without being asked. They delivered the calf together in the lantern-lit barn, working in near silence, breath rising in white clouds. When it was done and the calf was on its feet, Clara sat back in the hay and laughed, a full, real, unguarded laugh that rang out in the quiet barn like something long kept in a closed room finally given air. Thomas looked at her in the lantern light, and he knew, with a certainty that surprised him completely, that he did not want this woman to leave in the spring. That night, after Clara had gone to her room, Thomas sat alone by the dying fire for a long time. He was not a man who examined his own heart easily. He had spent 9 years building walls around the parts of himself that could be hurt. Quietly, practically, the same way he reinforced the barn walls before a hard winter. It was simply good sense. But sitting there in the dark kitchen, with the smell of the evening's bread still in the air, and the knowledge that someone was sleeping in the next room,
Someone who had walked 22 miles through a blizzard and delivered a calf in the dark and laughed in a cold barn as though it was the most natural thing in the world. He felt something he had not felt in 9 years. He felt not alone, and it frightened him more than the storm, because he understood, sitting there in the dark, that if she left in the spring, if this arrangement ended the way practical arrangements were supposed to end, the silence she left behind would be worse than the silence that had been there before, because now he would know what it was he was missing. He sat with that knowledge for a long time. Then he banked the fire, stood up straight, and made himself a quiet promise, not unlike the one Clara had made in that cold, dark barn 8 miles from Hawthorne. Whatever this is, I will not waste it. The real test came in February. Without warning, a second storm descended, harder than the first, and in the night came the sound every former dreads, a crack, a groan, and then a collapse. A section of the barn roof came down. 3 sheep and 2 cattle were trapped beneath debris in temperatures that would kill within hours. Thomas went in first. The beams were too heavy for one man. The structure above still shifted dangerously. He turned when he heard her behind him. "Go back to the house, Clara." She looked at him, said nothing, walked to the other end of the beam and lifted. They worked 4 hours in the dark and cold, lifting, dragging, guiding terrified animals to safety, one by one. In the second hour, a falling timber struck Clara across the left shoulder. She gasped, stood still for one moment, then adjusted her grip and kept working. Thomas saw it happen, and something in him, something that had been building quietly for weeks, broke fully open. When the last animal was safe, they stumbled back into the farmhouse in gray early morning light, battered, soaked, exhausted past words. Thomas sat at the kitchen table and put his face in his hands. He was not crying. He was doing something quieter and harder, the wordless breaking open that comes when a man finally understands what something means to him all at once, and the understanding is almost too much to hold. Clara sat across from him, quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and laid her hand over his. "We saved them," she said softly. He lifted his head and looked at her. "I did not stand up in that inn to love you. I did not offer you my name to love you. And yet, here I am, Clara, and I would not undo a single cold day of it." The kitchen was very still. "I walked 22 miles in a snowstorm, looking only for survival," she whispered. "I did not know I was walking toward something." She did not say the word love, but she did not let go of his hand. When spring came and the roads opened again, Hawthorne Village slowly remembered that Thomas Whitmore had taken a wife in the dead of winter. People came, as village people do, some from genuine kindness, some from curiosity. Mrs. Hooper from the inn brought a jar of preserved plums and stayed for tea. The blacksmith's wife came with a length of good wool fabric. Even some of the men who had laughed that January night came around, quietly, without ever acknowledging what they had done, and nodded their respect to Clara as though they had always given it. One afternoon, old Reverend Mills stopped by the farm on his way back from a parish visit. He found Clara in the kitchen garden, turning the first soil of spring, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair loose in the mild breeze. He stood at the gate for a moment, watching her work with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. "You look well, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. Clara straightened and looked at him, and the old rector saw something in her face that he had not seen the morning he had married her in the cold chapel. A settled, quiet, unshakable peace. "I am well, Reverend," she said, and then, simply, "I am home." Mills walked away smiling, thinking that of all the ceremonies he had performed in 40 years, that winter wedding, those two people with their practical vows and their handshake, had perhaps been the realest of all. Spring came to Yorkshire fully in late March, golden and unhurried. The fields turned from white to green, the cattle moved back to the pastures, the sheep grazed in the early morning quiet. And in the farmhouse at the edge of Hawthorne Village, a woman stood at the kitchen window with a cup of tea warming her hands, watching the light come across the hills. She was not frozen, she was not frightened, she was not alone. She was home. Thomas came and stood beside her, as he did most mornings now. "Southfield needs turning by end of week," he said. "I know," she said. A warm silence. "Clara." She looked at him. "Whatever you came here hoping to find, I hope it turned out to be more than you were hoping for." She looked at this quiet man who had once stood up in a room full of laughter for a frozen stranger and felt something steady and warm and permanent settle deep inside her. "It did," she said. She took his hand. They stood together at the window while the Yorkshire spring broke wide and golden over everything that was theirs. There is a kind of love that does not arrive with fanfare. It does not come announced with roses and declarations and perfect timing. Sometimes it comes through a door that flies open in a storm.
Sometimes it is built slowly, honestly, the way a barn is built or a field is turned, through hard work, through cold mornings, through showing up when it is difficult and staying when leaving would be easier. Clara and Thomas did not fall in love in the easy way. They built it quietly, carefully, in the space between exhaustion and honesty, in shared struggle and shared silence, and small acts of faithfulness that no one else ever witnessed. And perhaps that is the truest kind of all. Not the love that burns fast and bright, but the love that is planted in the coldest winter and is still standing, still growing when the spring finally comes. The kind that does not begin with passion, but with a hand reached across a table, and two people who simply refuse to let go. If this story found something in you today, if it reminded you that the most beautiful things in life are often built in the hardest seasons, that love does not always arrive the way we expect, but sometimes arrives exactly when we need it most, then friend, this channel was made for you. Here at Desert Hearth, we gather around stories that matter. Stories of quiet strength, of ordinary people who do extraordinary things simply by being faithful and kind and brave enough to take one more step forward when everything says stop. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to Desert Hearth right now. It costs you nothing, and it tells us that these stories are worth telling. Ring the bell so the next story finds you wherever you are, whatever winter you may be walking through right now. And if this story spoke to someone you love, a mother, a father, a friend sitting quietly somewhere tonight, share it with them, because some stories were never meant to be kept to yourself. We will see you at the next fire. Welcome home to Desert Hearth.